I always dreamed of having a space to grow my own fruit. I bought the house a few years ago, and as soon as I moved in, I started planting. Apples, pears, peaches, oranges. Each tree was lovingly cared for, and after a lot of hard work and patience, my orchard was finally bearing fruit. Every morning, I went out with a basket to pick fresh fruit, and nothing in the world could compare to the satisfaction of knowing that I no longer had to buy pesticide-laden fruit from the market. But this happiness bothered her. Ever since I moved in, the woman had tried several times to make me feel like I was breaking the rules. First, it was the color of my fence, then the potted plants on the balcony. When she realized that I didn't care about the pointless complaints, she tried to get the HOA involved, but, to her misfortune, there was no rule preventing anyone from having an orchard. That made her furious, and that's when she started spreading gossip around the neighborhood, saying that my trees were attracting pests and that this could devalue the properties. The argument was so ridiculous that even the neighbors who tolerated her started rolling their eyes whenever she opened her mouth. It was then that the woman decided to take more drastic measures. It all happened on a Tuesday morning. I woke up early, had my coffee quietly, and went out to see the orchard, as I did every day. But as soon as I got close to the trees, something seemed strange. The smell. Instead of the fresh scent of leaves and ripening fruit, there was a strong chemical smell in the air. Something wasn't right. I got closer, and then I saw my orchard was poisoned. The leaves of the trees were yellowing. Some of the fruit lying on the ground was completely burnt, and a strange white powder covered several branches. I knelt down to take a closer look, and my stomach sank. It was insecticide. Someone had broken into my property during the night and dumped poison all over my orchard, and I already knew exactly who had done it. I slowly raised my head and looked at her house. The curtains on the front window were slightly open, and I swear I saw a quick movement, like someone hiding after being caught. She thought she had won, but little did she know that the universe had other plans for her. I stood there in the middle of my orchard, feeling a mixture of anger, indignation, and a growing desire to see this woman pay for it. My orchard wasn't just a bunch of trees thrown in the yard. I had invested years in it. I took care of each seedling, protected it from pests in a natural way, without chemicals, to ensure healthy fruit. And now, in a single night, this woman thought she could ruin everything just because the existence of my orchard somehow offended her ego. I swallowed my anger and decided to investigate further before exploding. I took out my cell phone and started taking pictures of the trees, every burnt leaf, every fruit that fell to the ground, every inch of destruction, all documented. If she thought she was going to get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. But it was when I took a closer look that I noticed something strange. The insecticide hadn't been sprayed carefully. It didn't look like the work of a professional, or someone who really knew what they were doing. It was an attack made in haste. The white powder covered the leaves unevenly, as if it had been hurriedly thrown by someone who didn't want to be seen. It was obviously her. I took a deep breath and turned to look at her house. The curtains were still slightly open, and I sensed that she was still there, spying on me, waiting for my reaction. If she wanted war, then war she would have, but karma was already on its way. Over the next few days, I noticed something curious. Despite the destruction caused by the poison, something survived. The caterpillars. That's right. The same caterpillars that used to appear in my orchard from time to time, which I controlled manually so as not to use pesticides, were not completely exterminated by the poison. On the contrary, they seemed desperate to escape from the poisoned trees. And guess where they went? To the woman's garden. The first time I noticed this was when I saw a group of them crawling along the ground, following in a line as if they were on a survival mission. But when I went for a walk around the neighborhood, it was there that the irony was revealed in all its splendor. Her garden, which used to be the pride of the street, that impeccable yard full of flowers and shrubs pruned with almost military precision, was now being attacked by a horde of hungry caterpillars. The rose bushes, full of holes, the colorful flowers, reduced to dry stalks, the grass, with patches and chunks torn out. It was as if nature was taking revenge on my behalf. And then, the icing on the cake. One morning, I went out to get the newspaper and saw the woman kneeling in her own yard, completely desperate, pulling caterpillars off the plants with her hands while cursing to herself. It was hard to keep from laughing. She, who had tried to destroy my orchard, was now experiencing a real caterpillar apocalypse in her backyard. But the best was yet to come. If there's one thing I like more than seeing justice done, it's seeing nature give back in kind. And that's exactly what happened to this woman. After realizing that the caterpillars were attacking her garden with the fury of 1,000 hungry armies, I just watched, waiting to see how far it would go. And it didn't take long for the situation to get chaotic. For the first few days, she tried to resolve it with the force of hatred. Early in the morning, while I was having my coffee on the balcony, I saw the woman kneeling in the garden, picking up the caterpillars with her hands and throwing them into a plastic bag with an expression of pure despair. But for every one she took out, another 5 appeared. It didn't take her long to realize that the battle was lost. Then came her next brilliant plan, to call in a professional gardener. Later that week, I saw a truck parked in front of her house, and a guy in uniform getting out with a huge sprayer. She was next to him, talking fast, gesticulating as if explaining a war crime. He just shook his head, wrote something down, and then got to work. The smell of pesticide spread through the air again, and at that moment, I was sure she had no idea what a mistake she was about to make. Because, while she was spraying poison on everything, without any criteria, I already knew exactly what was going to happen next. 2 words: birds and bees. In an attempt to eliminate the caterpillars, the woman ended up exterminating everything that pollinated and protected her garden. Within a few days, the birds that used to visit her trees disappeared. The bees, they disappeared completely. And what happens to a garden that depends on pollination but is completely without pollinators? It dies. It's as simple as that. The flowers began to wilt. The leaves on the bushes lost their color. The grass that used to be a green carpet became stained, with yellowish patches spreading further and further. And the most beautiful thing of all? The caterpillars didn't disappear. They were just moving to other parts of the garden, surviving in the few spaces where the poison hadn't reached. The woman tried once again to call the gardener, but this time he refused to help. He probably realized that dealing with this crazy woman wasn't worth the price. That's when she finally panicked. One fine Saturday morning, while I was watering my orchard, yes, because my trees were starting to recover, since I knew how to neutralize the poison and rebalance the soil, I heard a scream coming from her house. "I can't take it anymore!" I stopped what I was doing and, with all the pleasure in the world, looked into her yard. The woman was kneeling in the dirt, pulling up clumps of dead grass, her hair messy and her face red with anger. The caterpillars were still there, devouring what was left of the garden. And now, on top of everything else, a few ants were scampering across the ground, probably attracted by the remains of the dying vegetation. I've never seen anyone so defeated. She stood there, looking at the devastated yard, her eyes watering as if she really didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. "Ah, dear, maybe it's because you threw poison at someone who didn't deserve it?" I laughed softly, grabbed another apple from my orchard, because yes, my trees were still bearing fruit, even after the cowardly attack, and took a bite, enjoying every second of the glorious sight of her disgrace. But, of course, this woman wasn't going to accept defeat without trying one last shot. And that's when she made the last mistake of her life in that neighborhood. After the complete disaster in her garden, any sensible person would have accepted defeat and moved on. But this woman? Sense? It was never in her vocabulary. Instead of admitting that she had dug her own grave, or rather, turned her own yard into a dry, bug-infested hole, she decided to double down. And so it was that, one apparently peaceful morning, I went out to water my orchard and found myself in front of a town hall car stopped at my door. And who was standing next to the inspector with his arms crossed and a mischievous smile on his face? Her. The woman reported me. The allegation? This man runs an illegal farm and is polluting the ecosystem in the neighborhood. I almost laughed in her face. The inspector, poor guy, looked more tired than anything else. He sighed, looked at the papers in his hand, and then at me. We've received a complaint about the inappropriate use of pesticides and environmental contamination, he said, clearly out of patience. The woman next to him already had that look of superiority on her face, ready to finally take me down. This time I've got you, her gaze said. But the problem with her strategy was simple. She forgot that the only person who threw poison where it didn't belong was her. You can look all you want, I said, shrugging. The inspector went through the gate and began to analyze my orchard. He touched the leaves, observed the soil, looked at the fruit on the branches. In a few minutes, he made a note and looked at me with a slight nod. Your trees are healthy. There are no signs of prohibited pesticides. The woman turned pale. But he has pests, she retorted, almost stuttering. I saw caterpillars coming out of here. The inspector frowned and looked around. It was then that he noticed something curious. The few caterpillars that still survived weren't in my orchard. They were in her yard. Madam, said the inspector, turning to the woman, have you noticed that the infestation isn't coming from his orchard, but from your garden? I swear I saw her soul leave her body for a second. What? That's absurd. But he wasn't joking. The inspector picked up a clipboard, made a few more notes, and let out a deep sigh. The kind of sigh that says, I've seen a lot of stupidity in this job, but this one breaks the record. You used a pesticide that eliminated the caterpillar's natural predators. With no birds and no pollinators, your garden became a perfect environment for infestation. I had to stop myself from laughing. Not only had she destroyed her own garden, but she was officially blamed for it in front of a city inspector. She opened her mouth to try to argue, but the inspector had had enough. I recommend that you sort out the problem in your own yard before making any more complaints. And that was that. She tried to destroy me, but all she managed to do was poison her own garden and turn her house into a luxury buffet for hungry caterpillars. And she still came out guilty in front of the town hall. The following days were glorious. The woman went into seclusion, probably trying to understand where her life had gone so wrong. The garden that used to be her pride became a veritable graveyard of plants. None of the flowers survived. What had once been a spectacle of color and well-tended shapes was now a barren, dreary field. The bushes were dry, twisted as if they had been cursed. The grass, once perfectly trimmed and as green as a golf carpet, looked like it had been through a radioactive apocalypse. It was sad to see, but, at the same time, poetically just. And the orchard? Well, my orchard was recovering very well. I knew how to neutralize the poison, and, with patience and the right care, the trees were growing strong again. New leaves were appearing, the branches were full of flowers, and soon the first fruits began to appear again. Every morning, as I walked through my orchard, I felt immense satisfaction in seeing that nature was restoring itself. The cycle of life was continuing, and her sabotage hadn't been able to stop it. But the biggest change wasn't in my orchard. It was in the attitude of the neighbors. After the scandal spread, no one wanted to be seen near her anymore. Even those who had previously feigned sympathy began to avoid her. If before she had been the most influential figure in the neighborhood, now she had become a burden that no one wanted to carry. What used to be a house always full of visitors was now a lonely place. The few times anyone passed by, it was only to peek curiously or whisper about her misfortune. The HOA, of course, tried to pretend that nothing had happened. But the truth is that this kind of thing can't be forgotten. The whole neighborhood knew what she had done, and no one trusted her anymore. The whispers and disapproving looks were her new reality. She went from queen of the HOA to the crazy person who killed her own garden and tried to sabotage her neighbors. And what about me? Well, I carried on picking my fruit. More than ever, my orchard became a symbol of resistance. The neighbors, who used to look at me suspiciously, began to greet me with smiles and even compliments. Some came to ask for gardening advice, others just to comment on how nice it was to see someone taking care of their own trees without the need for absurd HOA rules. I even thought about sending her a fruit basket, a simple gift, accompanied by a note that read, "Maybe a little vitamin C will help clear your head." But in the end, I thought it would be too cruel. She had already received her punishment, and I didn't need to stoop to her level. In the end, I didn't even need to take revenge. Nature did it for me. Justice came slowly and quietly, without the need for sharp words or acts of retaliation. While my orchard flourished and prospered, her garden withered. It was a perfect metaphor for what had happened between us. I got on with my life in peace, without the need for fights or resentment. She, on the other hand, was trapped in her own choices. And so the neighborhood moved on. People learned that excessive control and meanness get you nowhere. The HOA lost strength, the neighbors became more united, and life went on, as it always should have. Well, I carried on doing what I've always done. And don't forget to leave your likes and comments to support the channel. God bless, and see you